Melania Trump stepped into the prestigious Edward Bennett Williams Law Library Auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center, expecting a routine opportunity to elevate her post-White House brand. The event, framed as a high-minded conference on evidence-based child welfare policy, seemed like the perfect platform. Cameras from C-SPAN and the major networks were already set up, faculty from top law schools lined the seats, and the setting radiated prestige. What Melania couldn't foresee was that one panelist, Jasmine Crockett, had arrived not to participate in polite policy talk but to dismantle the very illusion Melania had built around her signature initiative. In the next 75 minutes, the cultivated image of concerned First Lady would begin to unravel, revealing a painful gap between public performance and true accountability. The Hart Auditorium glowed under soft November sunlight pouring in from tall, historic windows. The golden beam stretched across polished wood floors and bathed the room in a warmth that contrasted with the cool tension humming just beneath the surface. There was something in the air, a restless electric anticipation among the crowd of law professors, policy analysts, and graduate students. This wasn't just another conference. Something was about to happen. The scent of polished oak mixed with the rich aroma of dark roast coffee and the unmistakable musk of aged leather-bound books. It was the kind of academic atmosphere where evidence held weight and appearance meant nothing without substance. Reporters whispered predictions, students scribbled opening notes, professors shifted forward in their seats. The air itself seemed to brace for impact. On stage, the table of panelists was arranged with clinical precision. Microphones blinked green. A large screen behind the panel displayed the Georgetown Law Seal and the event's official title, Evidence-Based. Approaches to Child Welfare Policy, Measuring Outcomes, Ensuring Accountability. Every detail had been meticulously arranged, except for what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. Melania sat at the far end of the panel, composed and immaculate. Her cream Chanel blazer fit like armor. Her Cartier earrings caught the light. With every small turn of her head, and her leather-bound folder, embossed with gold initials, sat open before her. She looked every inch the seasoned diplomat. Every gesture had been rehearsed, every glance calibrated. This was her arena, or so she thought. To her left sat Dr. Patricia Richardson, a titan in the field of pediatric policy, and beside her, Professor Marcus Chen, known nationwide for his brutal honesty in dissecting failed programs. And then, quietly watching from the other end of the table, was Jasmine Crockett. She wore a navy blazer that spoke not of status but of readiness, chosen for utility, not flair. Her eyes missed nothing. In front of her, color-coded folders, annotated documents, and neatly stacked federal transcripts. She hadn't come to smile for the cameras. She'd come to hold someone accountable. As Dean Sarah Williams opened the session with warm academic pleasantries, Melania nodded politely, receiving praise for her Be Best initiative. The first question was gentle, open-ended, exactly as her media team had prepared her for. Dean Williams asked if she might reflect on the best ways to implement child welfare strategies that produced measurable results. Melania responded with ease. Her voice, slightly accented, carefully coached, flowed with polished phrases about compassion, dedication, and awareness. She spoke of the opioid crisis, of social media dangers, and of her initiative's heartfelt mission to protect children. But as she continued, the room began to sense a dissonance. Her words, though elegant, floated without weight. There were no statistics, no outcomes, no program structures, just broad themes and heartfelt concern. Professors exchanged glances. Students began underlining phrases in their notebooks like public-private partnerships and raising awareness, code for substance-free advocacy. Dr. Richardson's polite nods grew increasingly measured. Professor Chen's pen tapped the table, and Jasmine Crockett sat still. Then came the shift. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine began, her tone calm, measured, respectful. You mentioned opioid abuse prevention as one of Be Best's central priorities. Could you share with us the concrete data showing how many family-based treatment programs were supported? Specifically, what was the allocated budget, How many families received improved access to care due to Be Best initiatives? The question was surgical, polite on the surface, but beneath it cut straight to the nerve. Melania blinked. Her smile faltered, just slightly. She regrouped and answered, "The initiative was incredibly successful in raising awareness. We traveled nationwide, spoke with families, and brought attention to issues often ignored. But this was no fundraiser luncheon. This was a law school panel. And the audience wanted more than attention. They wanted results." Jasmine didn't flinch. She opened the first of her folders. The soft rustle of paper echoed through the auditorium like thunder. "That's very interesting," she said, holding up a federal report for the cameras to see. According to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, there was no increase in designated funding for family-based opioid treatment during Be Best's tenure. In fact, several key programs saw cuts, despite Be Best events promoting expansion. A hush fell over the room, and so it began. The unraveling wasn't explosive. It was quiet, controlled, strategic. Jasmine Crockett, with the precision of a veteran prosecutor, began dismantling the narrative, one documented fact at a time. Melania's posture stiffened. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening just slightly. Her eyes scanned the room, not for a supporter, but for a way out. She had walked into a conference. She had just been pulled into a hearing, and the cameras were still rolling. The mood inside the auditorium had shifted. What started as a polished conference now carried the tension of a courtroom. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her evidence spoke louder than any accusation could. Holding the government report in her hand, Jasmine gave the room a moment to absorb the contradiction. On one hand, Melania's polished remarks about awareness and compassion. On the other, cold federal data showing that not only was there no increase in treatment support, some services had actually been defunded. Jasmine let the silence stretch just long enough to let the weight of her words settle. "And this," she said softly, "is just the beginning." Melania adjusted her notes. She gave a brief nod, trying to reclaim the confidence she had walked in with. "There are many ways to evaluate success," she replied. Be Best wasn't just about funding. It was about inspiration, about giving families a voice. That phrase, giving families a voice, echoed for a second, then vanished in the rising tension of the room. It felt rehearsed, hollow. Jasmine's reply came gently, almost kindly. "Of course, awareness has value. But I'd like to understand what happened after the events. When those families returned home, what changed for them? Did any of their voices lead to specific policies or expanded care?" And with that, she opened the second folder. Inside were copies of letters, official ones, on the letterheads of advocacy organizations like the National Coalition for Family Recovery, Parents Against Youth Addiction, and Families United for Treatment Access. These weren't generic form letters. They were follow-ups, written by organizations who had participated in Be Best events. They were detailed, specific, and unanswered. "These groups wrote to your office," Jasmine said, gently tapping one of the letters. "They wanted to know what came next. They shared their trauma, their experiences. They trusted that sharing would lead to action, but not one of these received a reply. Would you like to read a few lines from them? Or would you prefer to explain why none of these letters were acknowledged?" Melania's breath caught just slightly. Her voice, still composed but quieter now, replied, "I'm not aware of every single letter that came in. The White House receives thousands every week. It's impossible for one person to manage every piece of correspondence." It was a reasonable point, at least on the surface. But Jasmine had anticipated it. "I understand that," she said. "Managing thousands of letters is an immense task, but these weren't just any letters. These were sent by the very organizations you stood beside in photographs, the same families featured in your press releases, the ones who believed their pain was being channeled into policy." She placed a set of glossy photos face up on the table. Images of Melania at Be Best events, posing with grieving parents, clasping hands, listening intently, always at the center of carefully crafted moments. The room grew quieter. The visual evidence was stark, compassion frozen in time but disconnected from any real follow-through. These people weren't asking for photo ops, Jasmine continued. They had already done that. They were asking about the policies they were promised. They were looking for updates, for hope. They were trying to find out if they had been heard or used. Melania's composure began to falter. Her fingers pressed against her notes, fidgeting slightly. The Cartier bracelet that had gleamed so confidently before now seemed to weigh down her wrist. I participated in many events, she said, more forcefully this time. I did my best to elevate their voices, but I can't remember every detail of every interaction. That's simply unrealistic. There it was, the first real crack. The once polished image of a deeply engaged former First Lady had just been reduced to a defense of forgetfulness. In trying to distance herself from the failures of her initiative, she was also undercutting the very narrative she had spent years crafting, that she had been personally involved, deeply moved, and fully committed. Jasmine allowed the moment to linger before she spoke again. No one expects you to answer every letter personally, she said, her voice calm, almost sympathetic. But when your initiative puts grieving families in the spotlight, asks them to share their pain and promises change, shouldn't there be some obligation to follow through? She opened another folder, her third, and out came a series of internal documents, emails, memos. Some were redacted but unmistakably official, bearing the seals of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the White House Office of Public Liaison. These communications, Jasmine explained, span the time during which Be Best promised to turn family input into formal policy recommendations. According to these agencies, no such recommendations were ever submitted. The gasps were quiet, restrained, but real. Melania's eyes flicked to the documents. Her expression tightened. These weren't administrative oversights, Jasmine said. These families were given timelines, specific dates when policy drafts would be sent to HHS, when they could expect progress updates. None of it happened. Melania started to speak, but Jasmine raised one more page. This document is from a Be Best planning meeting held in December 2019, she said. It's a transcript, and in it your senior staff explicitly discuss how to manage family expectations, how to prevent follow-up questions about programs that were never going to be implemented. Melania didn't speak. The silence was thunderous. Jasmine read a line aloud. We need to make sure these families understand this is about awareness, not policy. We can't have them calling in 6 months asking about initiatives that don't exist. The weight of that line sank into the room like concrete. It wasn't just about miscommunication anymore. It was about intent. Melania's voice, when it returned, was softer now, less assured. I wasn't involved in every planning meeting, she said. Staff talk among themselves. That doesn't mean I knew what was being said or what their tone or context was. Jasmine didn't respond with anger. She didn't need to. Instead, she let the silence speak again. The impact of Jasmine Crockett's statement lingered in the room, hanging heavy between the panelists and the audience like a fog that couldn't be cleared. The room, once filled with polite academic murmurs, now stood on the precipice of something much more significant. Melania Trump's carefully constructed image had taken a hit, a blow that came not from accusation, but from irrefutable documentation. The phrase, "concern without action isn't compassion," its performance was more than just a critique of a political figure. It had become a rallying cry for anyone who had ever felt the sting of broken promises, and as Jasmine's words continued to reverberate in the minds of the audience, the tension in the auditorium escalated. Melania's makeup, once flawless, seemed to betray her unease now. Her perfectly applied foundation couldn't conceal the tightening of her jaw or the occasional flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The audience, journalists, academics, and students alike, watched the unraveling of an image they had seen carefully cultivated for years. Jasmine remained calm, unfazed by the weight of the moment. She had prepared for this. She had anticipated, The deflections, the evasions, the rehearsed answers. She had expected the discomfort that now marked Melania's posture. What she hadn't expected, however, was the pervasive silence that followed her final statement. It was as if the truth had landed, and for the first time, Melania didn't have a ready rebuttal. "Let's talk about these families," Jasmine said, shifting her tone slightly but never losing the laser focus. "These are the people who trusted that their experiences would translate into meaningful action. They shared their pain with the hope that something would change. But instead they were invited to participate in a performance, a photo op. You promised them that their voices would be heard, that they would be a part of something that would make a difference." Melania's eyes shifted to the audience, scanning the room briefly as if searching for some sign of solidarity. But all she met was an array of eyes trained on her, waiting for answers, waiting for justification. "Your Be Best initiative," Jasmine continued, "may have raised awareness about important issues, but raising awareness doesn't solve problems. It doesn't save lives, and it certainly doesn't provide the support these families desperately need." Melania, ever the professional, straightened up in her chair, gathering her thoughts before she responded. "My time in the White House was dedicated to helping America's children," she said, her voice regaining some of its former composure. "I've always been committed to the well-being of children, especially those facing the opioid crisis and cyberbullying." But Jasmine wasn't finished. She flipped through her next set of documents, a collection of emails, memos, and government communications. As she set them down on the table, they sent a clear message to Melania. These weren't empty claims. These were hard facts. "Here," Jasmine said, "are the internal communications from the Department of Health and Human Services. These show that despite your initiative's promises, no specific policies were developed or implemented based on the feedback from the families you met. These were the same families who spoke at your events, and they have yet to see any real action." The rustling of paper was louder now, and the room seemed to lean in. Jasmine paused for a moment, letting the weight of the document settle in. "Your initiative," Jasmine continued, "wasn't about policy. It wasn't about helping families, it was about creating the illusion of care, about creating a narrative that looked good on camera, that could be shared with the public as a symbol of compassion, but lacked any real substance. And when these families came asking for the help they were promised, they were ignored." Melania's hand clenched around her folder, her knuckles white. It was a subtle movement, but it did not go unnoticed by those watching her. She had been exposed, not by harsh words or accusations, but by cold, hard evidence. The carefully constructed walls of her public image were beginning to crack under the pressure of reality. "I can't speak to every document you're presenting," Melania said, her voice slightly more defensive now, though she tried to hold on to her poise. "But I know that Be Best was a success in raising awareness. It brought attention to important issues that needed to be addressed. The conversation started, and that's where change begins." Jasmine didn't look at her, instead, continuing to sift through the papers in front of her. "The problem is, Mrs. Trump," she said, her tone cool and controlled, "awareness is a first step, but without policy changes to back it up, it's nothing more than a performance." Melania's response was slower this time, less sure. Jasmine cut her off, not with a harsh tone, but with a quiet, deliberate clarity. "I have here the official White House correspondence that was sent to these same organizations. They asked for follow-ups, they asked for actual action, but they never received any. These are not just vague requests, they're documented, time-stamped, and ignored." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the direction this conversation was headed. For the first time, it was clear that Melania had no immediate answer, no way to spin the conversation in her favor. The myth of Be Best as a truly transformative initiative was crumbling in real time. As Jasmine spoke, Melania glanced down at her notes, but it was clear she wasn't reading them anymore. The carefully crafted responses, designed to paint her as a compassionate figure, felt inadequate now. Her role in Be Best had been framed as one of genuine care and involvement, yet Jasmine's methodical questioning was pulling back the curtain on a different story. You promised these families that their experiences would lead to action. Jasmine pressed on, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. You promised them that their stories would help create the change they needed. But instead, they became part. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed through the auditorium. Concern without action isn't compassion, it's performance. The phrase clung to the air, a blunt truth that cut through the layers of political rhetoric and polished public personas. Melania Trump remained at the table, her face still composed, but the carefully maintained facade of confidence was cracking. The camera flashes, the studious glances from professors, and the quiet, calculating movements of the journalists were all focused on her. This wasn't just a policy discussion anymore. This was a pivotal moment, the unraveling of an image years in the making. Jasmine had not accused her of wrongdoing. She had simply shown the evidence. She had exposed the hollow truth behind the Be Best initiative, and Melania, despite her professional poise, was now standing in front of the truth that she could not deny. I think it's important to clarify that Be Best was never meant to be a government program. Melania finally spoke, her voice slightly strained but controlled. It was a platform to bring attention to issues that needed more focus. It was about starting conversations. The tone of her voice carried the familiar diplomatic cadence that she had mastered throughout her public career. But there was no avoiding the discrepancy between her words and the facts laid bare before her. Jasmine had meticulously presented the gaps in the program, gaps that Melania could no longer explain away with platitudes about starting conversations or raising awareness. Jasmine's eyes never left her. She had been methodical in her questioning, patient and precise. Mrs. Trump, she began again, her voice smooth but firm, awareness is only valuable if it leads to real action. Families affected by the opioid crisis, the children who are victims of cyberbullying, these are not abstract concepts. These are real people, real lives, and their futures were entrusted to an initiative that promised change. Melania's eyes darted to her right, meeting the gaze of Dr. Patricia Richardson, whose calm, scholarly demeanor contrasted sharply with the escalating tension in the room. Dr. Richardson's expression didn't betray much, but it was clear. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the promises would meet the reality of what had been delivered, or more accurately, what had been withheld. I disagree, Melania responded, her voice a little more resolute now. The initiative was successful in starting conversations. We met with families, we brought their issues to the forefront of national discourse. Jasmine, who had been leaning forward slightly, shifted back just enough to make the space between them feel more pronounced. She opened another folder, this one thicker than the others, filled with carefully organized government documents, official communications, and memos from advocacy organizations. Each page was a damning testament to the systemic failure of the initiative. This, Jasmine said, placing the documents on the table, is from the National Coalition for Family Recovery. They sent multiple requests for follow-up regarding the opioid prevention efforts you promised. Not a single response. Not one. The camera zoomed in on the folder, the images of the letterheads and the dates clearly visible. The quiet rustling of paper was the only sound in the room as everyone leaned in, waiting for Melania's response. Her fingers tightened around her folder. She started, but the words caught in her throat. She had rehearsed answers for every possible scenario. But this was different. This wasn't about speaking over difficult questions. This was about facing the truth head-on, a truth she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine pressed, you were at the center of these meetings. You invited these organizations to the table, promised them your support, and yet, they are asking why they've never received the follow-up they were told to expect. They are asking why their voices weren't translated into policy. Jasmine's voice didn't rise in anger. It was calm, methodical, like the voice of a prosecutor who had already secured their case. These are not the voices of political adversaries, Mrs. Trump. These are the voices of families who were left behind. Melania's gaze dropped to the table as though searching for something, anything, that could give her the right words. But the room had already seen the cracks in her narrative, and no amount of well-chosen words could repair the damage. Dr. Richardson, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. "The problem," she said, her tone measured but sharp, "is that a lack of response isn't just about missed communication. It's about broken trust. Families gave their stories, their pain, for the hope of policy change. They expected to be heard, not just to serve as backdrops for a publicity campaign." Melania turned toward Dr. Richardson, her expression more defensive than she'd intended. "I never intended to exploit anyone's pain. That was never the purpose of Be Best. It was about advocacy, raising awareness to bring about change." "But that's where the issue lies, isn't it?" Jasmine interjected, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Raising awareness is not the same as enacting real tangible change. What these families needed was support, not visibility. What they needed was action, not media coverage." The room had fallen into a tense silence. The only sound, the subtle hum of the building's air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers as Jasmine continued to methodically present the evidence. "You see, Mrs. Trump," Jasmine continued, "the tragic irony here is that the more you raised awareness, the more you distanced yourself from actual policy solutions. The more you gave the illusion of engagement, the less you gave to those who needed real help." Melania's shoulders tensed. The graceful veneer of diplomacy that had once been her shield now felt thin and brittle. She had come to Georgetown prepared for a discussion about child welfare policy. What she hadn't prepared for was a systematic exposure of the gap between her public persona and the reality behind Be Best. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire room had become a courtroom, with Jasmine Crockett playing the role of both prosecutor and judge, and Melania, despite her years of media training, was left with no defense except the thinly veiled rhetoric she had relied on for so long. "I don't think it's fair to say that nothing was done," Melania said, finally, her voice shaky but resolute. "We did what we could. We raised awareness. We made sure people knew about the issues. That in itself is valuable." Jasmine met her words with quiet patience. "Awareness is valuable, Mrs. Trump, but it is not enough. When people share their deepest wounds in the hope of change, they deserve more than to be used as pawns in a political game. They deserve policies that will..." The silence that filled the auditorium was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a profound weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. Even the camera crews, once intent on capturing the polished veneer of a political figure in control, now felt like passive observers, capturing a moment that defied the expectations of a well-scripted panel discussion. Jasmine Crockett's words, quiet yet deadly precise, had shattered the illusion Melania Trump had tried so hard to maintain. The phrase, "concern without action isn't compassion, it's performance," continued to echo in the minds of those in the room, and the effect was undeniable. The academic audience had not signed up for a political spectacle, but that was exactly what they were witnessing, a deeply uncomfortable unraveling of a narrative that had once seemed impervious to scrutiny. Melania's composure, which had once been so meticulously crafted, was slipping. Her eyes darted nervously between the documents Jasmine had presented and the expectant faces of the panelists and the audience. She shifted slightly in her seat, clearly uneasy but desperately trying to hold on to the poised image she had spent years cultivating. Her practiced confidence seemed more fragile by the second. I don't think it's fair to say that the initiative didn't have an impact," Melania said, her voice wavering just enough to be noticeable. "We raised awareness about the opioid crisis and the dangers of cyberbullying. We brought attention to issues that needed to be heard." Jasmine, still calm and unwavering, leaned forward, never breaking eye contact. "Awareness is important, Mrs. Trump, but awareness alone doesn't save lives. Awareness doesn't give families the support they need when their children are caught in the grips of addiction. Awareness doesn't provide the resources that can prevent the next tragedy from occurring. What these families needed wasn't a platform to be heard. It was a system to take action on their pain." The words felt like a damning indictment, and for a brief moment Melania appeared as though she might speak, but the words never came. She looked down at her notes, her hand unconsciously gripping the leather folder in front of her. There were no more prepared remarks, no more rehearsed talking points that could deflect the overwhelming evidence now laid out before her. Across the table, Dr. Patricia Richardson, a woman whose career had been built on providing real, actionable solutions to the problems of child welfare, nodded solemnly as Jasmine's questioning pierced through the polite academic veneer. Dr. Richardson, unlike the other panelists, had not made any attempt to hide her thoughts. Her discomfort was visible, though her gaze never wavered from Melania, as if silently urging her to provide the kind of leadership the moment demanded. Melania, her fingers still pressed tightly against the edge of her folder, looked up at Dr. Richardson briefly before turning to Jasmine. I was deeply committed to addressing these issues. I'm still committed. But policy change takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. But the question is, Mrs. Trump, Jasmine responded, her voice steady. How much time were these families given to wait for change that never came? You promised them help. You promised them support. You asked them to share their stories in the hope of real solutions. Yet the documentation I've presented shows that instead of policies being developed, the support was cut, and those same families were left with nothing. The sound of Jasmine's words was like the ticking of a clock in the background, counting down the moments Melania's defense had left. There was no more spinning, no more deflecting. Each answer she gave was met with the undeniable facts Jasmine had presented. And with every response, Melania's grip on the narrative weakened. Jasmine continued, I have here additional correspondence from the Department of Health and Human Services, the same organization that you claimed was working alongside Be Best to help these families. These documents show that they never received any recommendations from your initiative, despite repeated public promises that you were working with them. Another folder was placed on the table. This one contained official memos and letters from the HHS, all stamped with the department's seal, each one documenting the repeated requests for information, for follow-up, for updates that never came. The evidence was indisputable. Jasmine's quiet demeanor only added to the drama unfolding. She wasn't attacking. She was simply presenting the facts, allowing them to speak for themselves. Melania's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water in front of her. She took a sip, the coolness doing little to calm her nerves. She had faced difficult moments before in her public life, but this felt different. This wasn't a diplomatic event where she could dodge hard questions with charm and grace. This was a dissection, a breakdown of every claim she had made about Be Best. Listen, Melania said, trying to steady her voice. I understand that you believe there are gaps in the initiative, but you have to understand, the intention behind Be Best was never to replace government programs. It was meant to complement them, to bring attention to issues that often go ignored. Jasmine didn't let her off the hook. Complementing government programs isn't enough if those programs are already failing. If you were genuinely interested in addressing these issues, then Be Best should have been pushing for the policy changes that would have supported these families, not just giving them a voice in the media. The room was silent again. The camera crews who had once been fixated on Melania's composed demeanor now panned out, capturing the entire scene. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of the unfolding truth. Melania's story, the one she had told the world, was now being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Professor Marcus Chen, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. The silence that filled the auditorium was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a profound weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. Even the camera crews, once intent on capturing the polished veneer of a political figure in control, now felt like passive observers, capturing a moment that defied the expectations of a well-scripted panel discussion. Jasmine Crockett's words, quiet yet deadly precise, had shattered the illusion Melania Trump had tried so hard to maintain. The phrase, concern without action isn't compassion, it's performance, continued to echo in the minds of those in the room, and the effect was undeniable. The academic audience had not signed up for a political spectacle, but that was exactly what they were witnessing, a deeply uncomfortable unraveling of a narrative that had once seemed impervious to scrutiny. Melania's composure, which had once been so meticulously crafted, was slipping. Her eyes darted nervously between the documents Jasmine had presented and the expectant faces of the panelists and the audience. She shifted slightly in her seat, clearly uneasy but desperately trying to hold on to the poised image she had spent years cultivating. Her practiced confidence seemed more fragile by the second. I don't think it's fair to say that the initiative didn't have an impact," Melania said, her voice wavering just enough to be noticeable. "We raised awareness about the opioid crisis and the dangers of cyberbullying. We brought attention to issues that needed to be heard." Jasmine, still calm and unwavering, leaned forward, never breaking eye contact. "Awareness is important, Mrs. Trump. But awareness alone doesn't save lives. Awareness doesn't give families the support they need when their children are caught in the grips of addiction. Awareness doesn't provide the resources that can prevent the next tragedy from occurring. What these families needed wasn't a platform to be heard. It was a system to take action on their pain." The words felt like a damning indictment, and for a brief moment Melania appeared as though she might speak, but the words never came. She looked down at her notes, her hand unconsciously gripping the leather folder in front of her. There were no more prepared remarks, no more rehearsed talking points that could deflect the overwhelming evidence now laid out before her. Across the table, Dr. Patricia Richardson, a woman whose career had been built on providing real, actionable solutions to the problems of child welfare, nodded solemnly as Jasmine's questioning pierced through the polite academic veneer. Dr. Richardson, unlike the other panelists, had not made any attempt to hide her thoughts. Her discomfort was visible, though her gaze never wavered from Melania, as if silently urging her to provide the kind of leadership the moment demanded. Melania, her fingers still pressed tightly against the edge of her folder, looked up at Dr. Richardson briefly before turning to Jasmine. "I was deeply committed to addressing these issues. I'm still committed, but policy change takes time. It's not something that happens overnight." "But the question is, Mrs. Trump," Jasmine responded, her voice steady, "how much time were these families given to wait for change that never came? You promised them help. You promised them support. You asked them to share their stories in the hope of real solutions. Yet the documentation I've presented shows that instead of policies being developed, the support was cut, and those same families were left with nothing." The sound of Jasmine's words was like the ticking of a clock in the background, counting down the moments Melania's defense had left. There was no more spinning, no more deflecting. Each answer she gave was met with the undeniable facts Jasmine had presented. And with every response, Melania's grip on the narrative weakened. Jasmine continued, "I have here additional correspondence from the Department of Health and Human Services, the same organization that you claimed was working alongside Be Best to help these families. These documents show that they never received any recommendations from your initiative, despite repeated public promises that you were working with them." Another folder was placed on the table. This one contained official memos and letters from the HHS, all stamped with the department's seal, each one documenting the repeated requests for information, for follow-up, for updates that never came. The evidence was indisputable. Jasmine's quiet demeanor only added to the drama unfolding. She wasn't attacking. She was simply presenting the facts, allowing them to speak for themselves. Melania's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water in front of her. She took a sip, the coolness doing little to calm her nerves. She had faced difficult moments before in her public life, but this felt different. This wasn't a diplomatic event where she could dodge hard questions with charm and grace. This was a dissection, a breakdown of every claim she had made about Be Best. "Listen," Melania said, trying to steady her voice, "I understand that you believe there are gaps in the initiative, but you have to understand, the intention behind Be Best was never to replace government programs. It was meant to complement them, to bring attention to issues that often go ignored." Jasmine didn't let her off the hook. Complementing government programs isn't enough if those programs are already failing. If you were genuinely interested in addressing these issues, then Be Best should have been pushing for the policy changes that would have supported these families, not just giving them a voice in the media. The room was silent again. The camera crews, who had once been fixated on Melania's composed demeanor, now panned out, capturing the entire scene. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of the unfolding truth. Melania's story, the one she had told the world, was now being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Professor Marcus Chen, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. "What this shows us, Mrs. Trump, is not just the failure of an initiative, it shows us the dangerous gap between public policy and public performance. It shows us how easy it is to masquerade as a champion of change when, in reality, nothing is being done to address the root causes." Melania's face tightened, and she glanced around the room, as if searching for someone to offer support. But no one spoke. The professors, the students, the journalists, they were all watching this unfold with rapt attention, not out of curiosity, but because they recognized that they were witnessing something far more important than a simple panel discussion. They were witnessing a moment of accountability. "I am not responsible for every detail of every program," Melania said. The stillness in the room hung like a thick fog, each second stretching longer than the last as Melania Trump sat motionless at the table. The usual composure, which had been so integral to her public persona, was nowhere to be found. For the first time, she was not the one in control of the narrative. Jasmine Crockett was. Every eye in the room was now trained on Melania. Professors, journalists, students. They had all come to witness a conversation about child welfare and policy implementation, but what they had found instead was a much more profound moment, a reckoning with a public figure who had been caught in the web of her own rhetoric. Jasmine Crockett, still calm and composed, had skillfully unraveled the carefully constructed image that had defined Be Best. The initiative that Melania had championed so passionately was now exposed as little more than a performance, an act of political theater that had promised change but delivered none. What began as a showcase of compassion and goodwill had become a stark lesson in accountability, as Jasmine's evidence methodically stripped away the layers of distraction. Melania's fingers continued to drum lightly against her portfolio, a nervous tick that betrayed her anxiety. The woman who had once stood poised and unshakable, addressing crowds with the serene confidence of a first lady, now seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. Her carefully rehearsed responses were no match for the blunt force of Jasmine's questions and the irrefutable documentation she had presented. "I did what I thought was best," Melania finally said, her voice quieter now, tinged with a hint of defensiveness. "I raised awareness. I did everything I could to make sure that these families were heard." Jasmine, undeterred, leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Melania's. "Raising awareness is one thing, Mrs. Trump, but that's not enough. Not when you have the power to make real change. The families who participated in Be Best didn't just want to be heard. They wanted help. They wanted action. And when they came asking for the support you promised, they were met with silence." Her words hung in the air, piercing the veneer of Melania's narrative. For a brief moment, Melania seemed at a loss for how to respond. She had relied on public relations and well-crafted speeches for so long, but this was different. The weight of truth, unadorned by political spin or media spectacle, was something she couldn't escape. "They trusted you," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and deliberate. "They shared their most painful experiences, believing that their voices would lead to action. Instead, they became part of a campaign, an initiative that presented itself as a solution, but never delivered." "Anything concrete?" Melania's gaze dropped once more to her notes, as if searching for something that would help her regain control of the conversation. But nothing could undo the damage that had been done. The truth, laid out in black and white before her, couldn't be disputed. "You asked them to participate to expose their pain," Jasmine said, her tone now infused with a quiet intensity. "You asked them to trust you, and they did. But what happened when they came looking for answers, for resources, for policies? They were left with nothing." The camera crews zoomed in, capturing every moment, every flicker of emotion on Melania's face. The once immaculate image of the former First Lady, poised and composed, now seemed fragile, like a figure constructed from fragile glass, teetering on the edge of collapse. The silence in the room deepened. No one moved. No one spoke. The audience could feel the shift, the palpable change in the atmosphere as the facade of political performance crumbled. Dr. Patricia Richardson, who had remained mostly silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke, her voice calm but pointed. "This is not about attacking anyone personally, Mrs. Trump," she said, her gaze steady. "This is about the responsibility that comes with being in a position of power, especially when that power is used to influence the lives of vulnerable families. And the reality is, Be Best did not live up to the promises made." Melania raised, her head slightly, as if Dr. Richardson's words had hit their mark. For a moment, the look in her eyes softened, as though the weight of her failure had finally begun to sink in. "I did my best," Melania replied quietly. But there was an undeniable weariness in her voice now. The confidence that had once been so characteristic of her public appearances had evaporated, replaced by a reluctant acknowledgement of the gap between her intentions and the outcomes. Jasmine, who had been watching the exchange with focused precision, leaned back slightly in her chair. "Your best wasn't enough," she said. "And in politics, in public service, that's the point. The families who trusted you deserve more than well-meaning efforts. They deserve results." Melania's face tightened as the full weight of the moment seemed to finally crash down on her. There were no more words to deflect the reality that Jasmine had exposed. The public figure who had been hailed for her compassion, her platform, and her media savvy was now nothing more than a woman who had failed to deliver on her promises, no matter how carefully those promises had been packaged and sold. "You've exposed the cracks in the narrative," Melania said, her voice barely audible now. "But the intention was always to help, and I still believe that the initiative brought attention to important issues." Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She simply allowed the silence to stretch between them. There was nothing more to be said. The truth had been laid out, and no amount of defense could undo what had already been exposed. The academic audience, which had once come to this conference expecting a discussion of policy, had instead witnessed something far more important. The dissection of a public narrative. As the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words sank in, the room seemed to breathe in unison. The once pristine atmosphere of Georgetown Law's auditorium had been transformed into a place of undeniable accountability. What had started as a typical academic panel had evolved into a profound lesson in public service and the very human cost of performative politics. Melania Trump's carefully maintained facade had been exposed, layer by layer, by a steady stream of hard evidence. The methodical questions, the official documents, the unanswered letters, they had all come together to dismantle the narrative she had worked so tirelessly to uphold. What remained was not a public figure advocating for vulnerable families, but a politician caught in a cycle of rhetoric, disconnected from the very people she had claimed to champion. The cameras, once focused on Melania's poised appearances, now seemed to capture a woman lost in the harsh light of truth. Melania, whose public speeches had been crafted for applause, now sat in silence. Her gaze was fixed downward, her fingers still nervously clutching the edges of her leather portfolio, but the smooth surface she had once polished was now scratched by the sharp reality unfolding around her. The academic audience, which had come expecting to engage in a discourse about child welfare policy, had instead been swept into a broader reflection on the nature of accountability in public service. They had witnessed firsthand the consequences of public figures using their positions not to enact meaningful change, but to stage political performances. Jasmine Crockett, whose presence had once seemed like a simple challenge to the status quo, now stood as the moral center of the discussion. She had proven that accountability was not just about asking questions. It was about the courage to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made those in power. But Jasmine's calm and measured approach had not only revealed the gaps in Melania's initiative, it had illuminated something far more critical: the profound responsibility that comes with public trust. The families who had believed in Be Best had been misled, not by abstract promises but by real human lives caught in a political game. "Mrs. Trump," Jasmine spoke again, her voice still steady, but this time, it carried the weight of finality. The purpose of Be Best, as you've said, was to raise awareness. But the question we all must ask now is, what happens when awareness isn't enough? When the issues you raise go unresolved? When the promises you make aren't kept? That's where the gap lies, the gap between words and actions. Melania sat motionless, her eyes focused on the table, her lips pressed tightly together. She had no more defenses left, no more rehearsed speeches or media-friendly sound bites to fall back on. She had been unmasked by someone who had come prepared, not with rhetoric but with evidence. We can't just have awareness, we can't just have the shining moment of political theater, Jasmine continued, her voice cutting through the silence. These families, these people, who you invited to share their stories, their trauma, believed that their pain would lead to real change. What they got instead was a platform, a stage for your initiative to take center stage while their needs were left unmet. For a moment there was no sound in the room except for the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning. The weight of Jasmine's words seemed to reverberate in the minds of everyone present. Professors who had once attended, policy panels with academic detachment now leaned forward, their attention fully engaged. Students who had come to learn about child welfare and policy were now watching an entirely different lesson unfold, one about the difference between genuine public service and political performance. Melania shifted slightly in her chair, still trying to maintain an air of control, but there was no denying that she had lost the narrative. She was no longer the figurehead of an initiative that had promised to protect children and families. She had become the face of a policy that had failed, not because of a lack of effort, but because of a lack of genuine commitment. Jasmine's tone softened as she spoke once more. We can't keep pretending that awareness and publicity are enough. These families came to you hoping for real solutions. Instead, they were given a story to tell, one that had nothing to do with the real work they needed to be done. The room was now a space filled with the uncomfortable hum of truth. The walls of Georgetown Law, which had once hosted distinguished speakers and groundbreaking debates, had now witnessed something far more significant: the unmasking of a carefully constructed political initiative, and in its place there was a clearer understanding of what true public service looked like and what it didn't. Melania's voice was quiet now, softer than before, as if the realization of her failure had settled in. I didn't mean for it to turn out this way, she said, her words faltering. I thought raising awareness was the first step, but I understand now that it wasn't enough. I see that. Jasmine gave a small nod, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. It's never too late to make a difference, but making a difference requires more than just raising awareness. It requires taking responsibility for the impact of your actions, or your inactions. The weight of Jasmine's words lingered, and for the first time, Melania seemed to acknowledge the full extent of the failure. She had been an advocate, a public figure who had promised change, but the reality of her initiative's impact, its lack of impact, was impossible to deny. You can't just perform compassion, Jasmine continued, her voice now carrying a quiet but resolute authority. Compassion requires action. It requires real, tangible results. And it requires taking responsibility when things don't go as planned. Melania's gaze lifted as the silence continued to stretch in the Georgetown Law Auditorium. A subtle but undeniable shift occurred. The very fabric of what had started as an academic conference on child welfare and policy had now become a crucible for accountability, and the temperature in the room had risen significantly. The audience, once merely observers of an intellectual discussion, had now become witnesses to something far more poignant: an exposure of the delicate balance between public performance and the real work of public service. Jasmine Crockett sat, still, her posture impeccable, the calm center in the midst of this storm. She had come prepared not just with documents and evidence, but with the resolve to challenge the status quo. The quiet, methodical manner in which she had dismantled Melania Trump's narrative was deliberate. There was no need for theatrics. Her presence alone, coupled with the undeniable weight of the facts, had transformed the conversation into a reckoning. A moment when truth had to be faced, no matter how uncomfortable it was for the person on the receiving end. Melania, for her part, had tried to keep her composure. But now, as the weight of the last hour bore down on her, it was clear that her veneer of confidence had cracked. She had been the architect of a narrative about Be Best, one that was rooted in idealism, in a belief that raising awareness could somehow equate to real change. But Jasmine had shown, with laser-like precision, that awareness without action is just a hollow shell. The room had grown still. Professors, students, and journalists had been drawn into the unfolding drama. No longer was this an academic exercise. It had evolved into something far more visceral, as real families, the ones Melania had claimed to champion, were held up as evidence of a broader truth, that political theater can often mask systemic failures. Jasmine's gaze remained steady on Melania. She had already asked her questions, presented her evidence, and made her case. But now the final part of the conversation was about something much deeper than facts. It was about acknowledgement. "Mrs. Trump," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "You've said that you did what you thought was best, that you raised awareness, but you also promised these families something more. You promised them help. Real help." Melania, her face pale, nodded slowly. I wanted to help. I thought by raising awareness, I was doing what was needed, but I see now." She trailed off, her words faltering as if the realization had finally hit her. She had always believed that her high-profile events, her carefully crafted speeches, her public appearances would make a tangible difference. She had believed that visibility would be enough. But now, as she faced the undeniable truth, she understood the gulf between intention and impact. Jasmine allowed the pause to linger, the tension between them palpable. She had asked Melania to face this moment, to confront not just the shortcomings of Be Best, but the moral consequences of using people's pain for political gain. The silence was heavy. But Jasmine knew that Melania's moment of self-awareness, however painful, was a crucial step in moving forward. "We can't just raise awareness and call it a victory," Jasmine said gently. "Real change comes when you follow through, when you take responsibility for the lives that are impacted by the promises you make." Melania's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had fought to maintain control of the narrative, to ensure that her legacy as First Lady would be defined by her compassion and her initiative. But Jasmine had made it impossible to ignore the truth. Be Best had been a performance, not a policy. It had raised awareness, but it had not delivered anything of substance, and now the consequences of that failure were clear for everyone to see. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Melania whispered, almost to herself. Her voice cracked slightly, as though the weight of the entire conversation had finally settled on her. "But I see now. I see that I missed something important." Jasmine nodded, her expression softening. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Mrs. Trump, but it starts with accountability. It starts with accepting that the path you took didn't lead to the change you promised." For a moment, it seemed as though Melania might respond, but the words didn't come. She had no defense left, no prepared statement that could deflect the reality that Jasmine had laid bare. The academic audience, once passive observers, now seemed united in their understanding of what had just transpired. This wasn't about partisan politics. It was about the moral responsibility that comes with holding power. It was about the impact of public service and the ways in which those entrusted with influence must answer for the promises they make. Dr. Patricia Richardson, who had watched the exchange with quiet intensity, finally spoke again. "This is what accountability looks like," she said, her voice steady. "It's not just about acknowledging what went wrong. It's about understanding the deeper consequences. The families who participated in Be Best are still waiting for the changes they were promised, and their stories, their pain, deserve more than political spin." The words hung in the air, reinforcing the point that had been made over the last hour, that awareness and visibility were not enough. Real, systemic change required action. It required a willingness to face the truth and take responsibility for the lives that had been affected by promises that went unfulfilled. Melania's head dropped slightly, as though she could no longer bear the weight of the moment. The room had turned on her, not with anger, but with a quiet recognition of what had been exposed. There was no more room for deflection, no more space for excuses. The truth had been revealed, and there was nowhere left to hide. But Jasmine didn't press her any further. The damage had already been done. The truth had been exposed not through accusations, but through evidence, through methodical questioning, through patient persistence, and through an unwavering commitment to uncovering what had been obscured by a carefully crafted public image. As the session drew to a close, Jasmine stood up, gathering her folders. She had come to Georgetown Law not just to participate in a discussion about policy, but to show the world that accountability was possible, even when it meant challenging the most carefully constructed narratives. Melania remained seated, her face a mixture of frustration and realization. She had fought hard to maintain control, but in the end she had been forced to face the truth. Be Best had not been a success. It had been a performance, and the families who had trusted her had been left in the wake of that performance, still waiting for the help they had been promised. As the room began to empty, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The audience, still processing what had transpired, filed out of the auditorium with quiet conversations. The journalists were already drafting their stories. The students were preparing to take notes for the next lesson. But the lesson they had witnessed today would stay with them for far longer than any academic discussion on child welfare policy. The final question that hung in the air was simple, yet profound. What happens when public figures use their platform to raise awareness, but never follow through with real action? The answer, it seemed, had just been delivered in the most public of ways. As the last few participants filtered out of the Georgetown Law Auditorium, the finality of the moment still lingered in the air. The building, so often filled with the hum of academic discussion, now felt different. The words spoken, the evidence presented, and the uncomfortable silence that followed had all combined to create a moment of undeniable clarity. The veneer of political performance had been peeled away, exposing the gaps between the promises made and the reality of what was delivered. Jasmine. Crockett had come to this conference prepared not only with documents but with a singular goal: to hold those in power accountable. She had done so, not through loud accusations, but through quiet persistence and the steady application of evidence. The contrast between Melania Trump's polished public persona and the stark truths revealed in the documents was undeniable. As the session ended, the academic audience remained deep in thought, processing the gravity of what had just transpired. Professors who had likely attended countless policy discussions and law symposia now found themselves reflecting on the broader implications of the day's events. Students, who had come to learn about child welfare policy, had witnessed something far more profound: how the public figures they often read about in the headlines could be held accountable through the patient work of questioning, investigation, and, most importantly, the courage to demand answers. Melania Trump, once the poised, ever-composed figurehead of Be Best, now sat at the table alone, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on her. Her mind seemed to be racing, her thoughts drifting over the evidence that had been presented, the facts that could not be ignored. Jasmine, having said what needed to be said, did not linger for long. She had no need to gloat or press further. The work was done. The truth had been uncovered, and the implications of that truth were now on display for all to see. But before she left, she paused, looking back at Melania. There was no malice in her gaze, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been achieved. Jasmine had exposed the systematic failures of an initiative that had relied on performance and empty rhetoric, but she had done so with integrity, compassion, and a focus on the families who had been left behind. "Mrs. Trump," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying the final weight of their exchange, "it's not too late to change. It's not too late to make this right. But it starts with accepting responsibility, not just for the public image you've built, but for the lives you've touched and failed to follow through with. Melania looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the beginning of the panel. The layers of defense she had once relied on, the practiced composure, the carefully crafted public speaking skills, had all but evaporated. What remained was a woman who was now facing the consequences of years of performative politics. The weight of Jasmine's words hit her harder than any public rebuke or press release could. For a moment, Melania remained silent. But then, quietly, she nodded. The words weren't much, but they were the most honest she had spoken all day. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was an admission, and while it wasn't an apology, it was something far more important. An acknowledgement that the promises made by Be Best had not been met, and the families who had trusted her initiative were right to feel let down. Jasmine nodded, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the moment. There was no victory to claim here. There was no triumph in exposing the truth. There was only the quiet understanding that the system had worked as it was meant to, that when given the chance, accountability could not be avoided, no matter how carefully a public figure might try to deflect. As the doors to the auditorium opened, the last of the audience filed out, their quiet conversations bubbling up around them. But none of them left unchanged. They had all seen something rare, a public figure exposed not by scandal or media storm, but through methodical questioning and the steady application of evidence. This was a moment that would resonate far beyond this particular panel, long after the cameras had gone. It was a moment that spoke to the broader power of accountability. Melania remained seated at the table for several minutes after the last person had left. The sound of the doors closing behind her seemed to punctuate the finality of the moment. The grand auditorium, once filled with the excitement of an academic gathering, now felt empty. She was alone, left with nothing but the knowledge that, for better or worse, the narrative she had carefully constructed was no longer hers to control. The world outside Georgetown law would continue, the media would cover the next political story, and life would move on. But for the families who had been misled by the Be Best initiative, and for the advocates who had fought for their voices to be heard, this moment would be remembered. It would be remembered as a pivotal time when the walls of political performance crumbled under the weight of truth, and when the evidence of that truth became undeniable, no one could look away. For Jasmine, this moment had been about more than just holding Melania accountable. It had been about restoring the dignity of those who had been used, exploited for political gain, without any real intention of helping them. Be Best had promised them change, but it had given them only visibility. And now, thanks to Jasmine's work, that fact was out in the open for all to see. As she walked away from the podium, her steps measured and calm, Jasmine knew the work was far from done. But today, she had made one thing clear. Accountability matters. And when the truth is exposed, there is no place left for performance.